Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to talk about how to face the Catalan, like exactly what you should do if somebody just kind of closes their eyes and plays d4, c4, and then fianchettos their bishop to the light square diagonal. The Catalan is actually a really good opening. The Catalan was a favorite of Vladimir Kramnik, and as far as system openings go, just closing your eyes and developing your bishop to the diagonal and castling, it's actually pretty good. If you want to play an opening where you can close your eyes and play the first 7 moves in your sleep, I would say the Catalan is the way to go. And of course, the guy that you want to take a look at in terms of who you should follow to try to figure out how to play the Catalan really well are, guys like Anatoly Karpov played the Catalan very well. And of course, guys like Vladimir Kramnik played the Catalan very well. Now, meeting the Catalan as black is a very difficult task, actually. I remember one time somebody told me that until you hit about 2400, you don't really have a defense against the Catalan. There's a lot of truth to that. The Catalan, as far as like a positional opening, it's got to be positionally the most sound opening I've ever seen. You put your bishop on the long diagonal and you have a solid presence in the center and you don't have any bad pieces. So it's actually really difficult for black to meet this. Already black actually has a bad bishop on c8, so just finishing our development on the queen side is very difficult. So here you have a decision to make between the open Catalan and the closed Catalan. And I would say that I want my opponent to at least have to make some decisions in the game, and I want him to have to know at least a little bit of theory. So my recommendation is to play the open Catalan, and I really feel like at the highest levels, I feel like this is the only option. But even at club levels, I feel like you need to do this. You need to put a question to white's setup, because simply playing a closed Catalan, just playing pawn to c6, doesn't really put any pressure on white to find an advantage. After pawn to c6, black's position is certainly solid, and you're not going to lose yourself in the next 10 moves, but you're certainly a little bit worse for the rest of the game, and white doesn't have to put a ton of effort into proving that. He's already got more space and a better position. So I recommend just taking this pawn, and this actually puts a little bit of pressure on white because he has to get this pawn back, and if he doesn't, then black ends up with an extra pawn. And it's not actually entirely clear how white gets this pawn back. It's also still not clear how black finishes his queenside development. So at this point, this requires a lot of theoretical knowledge from both sides because the next really 5-6 moves are highly critical and we have to play them with an extreme amount of accuracy. Now, I would break this down into basically 3 moves that get played the most with white. White plays queen c2 to try to get the pawn back. White plays knight e5 to try to get the pawn back. And then I would say also white plays knight on b to d2 a lot on like the amateur level to try to get the pawn back. So my recommendation for the most part is kind of any move that doesn't immediately play knight e5 and open up the bishop to this diagonal. Pretty much you're going to play b5. So of course the only exception to that would be pawn to a4. Now, if they play pawn a4, you should prevent knight to e5 by immediately playing knight c6. This was actually played by Bologan versus Akopian in Moscow in 2002. That game continued knight a3 and then simply knight a5 to defend the pawn, bishop g5, and then knight d5, bishop e7, queen e7, e4, knight b4, we're targeting the d3 square, queen e2, and then we finished our development with b6. And then bishop a6. So you can see what he did there. He just kind of held this pawn and finished his development. All of his pieces are developed, and Victor Bologan was able to go on and win this game with the black pieces, and actually black probably already has an advantage right here. So we took the pawn, we held it, and then white was kind of unable to prove that he could get this pawn back, so to speak. So that's if they play a4, and on pretty much any other move, so like for example, knight on b to d2, we're just going to be holding this pawn. So that's all we're going to be doing. We're just going to be holding this pawn directly. We're going to be playing b5, and we're just going to be holding this pawn. So the only way that we can't play b5 other than a4 is if they try the move queen a4, in which case they've pretty much stated their intention. They're going to take this pawn with the queen. So we're just going to kind of tempo it. And we've got kind of 2 choices to tempoing the queen. If we want to, we can be very superficial. We can just get this bishop to the light square diagonal. And at least theory thinks that this is supposed to be okay. So this has actually led to quite a few draws. Another way we can go is we can tempo the queen with a6, and then after queen c4 we can play b5, and then finish our development with bishop b7. And theory thinks this is also okay, and this is supposed to lead to equality. There's actually quite a few Kramnik games that stem from here. So let's go back to queen c2, or the more common club move I would say is knight on b to d2. And again, pretty much anything that allows it, that doesn't play knight e5, that doesn't physically prevent b5. We're playing b5 here. And we're not concerned if they play knight e5 at any point, because we do have the move knight d5 to cover that threat. And that's something you got to keep in mind. Knight d5 is a good way to cover this diagonal, because then when they kick that knight with e4, you move that knight out of the way, and they've actually got a little bit of a logjam with the knight on e5. They can't push the pawn again immediately, and even if they could, you could just shuffle the knight back to d5. Knight d5 is an important defensive maneuver to keep in mind. And a lot of times you also have c6, but you'll see white decided to take that away from black here. He played a4, c6, and then he took, and then he played knight e5, but black was able to just simply say, hey, I've got knight e5 here, and your position's kind of a little bit of a joke. And this turned out to be true in Longo versus Geller in 1991. And Geller actually went on to win the game pretty easily. He finished his development, and then he actually missed a small little improvement here in the game. He should have, in this position, just simply played the move a5 with kind of a decisive advantage for black, a very easy decisive advantage. Instead, he played the move, he retreated his knight, he played knight a6, he allowed d5, and he actually still won this after this series of exchanges that went really well for black. White had no choice but to resign. The problem isn't so much that the rook on f1 is trapped. The problem is that we have multiple threats. We're also threatening to take and make a queen, and we're also threatening to take the rook on a6. So it made it very difficult for white to find a move here, because if white plays a move, for example, bishop takes a8, we don't take that rook, we don't take that pawn, we don't take that bishop. We simply take the hanging rook on a6, and everything else is still hanging. So we have the rook hanging on f1, the bishop hanging on a8, and we have this threat of, simply pawn captures pawn followed by pawn equals queen. And we simply can't meet all of those threats simultaneously. We can meet, maybe one or two of them. We can play bishop e4 and meet the threat of the pawn, and we can save our bishop, but that doesn't save our rook. So because of that, white resigned, and it was a pretty reasonable resignation. Black is probably just winning in this position. So we go back to knight on b to d2. Knight on b to d2 isn't something you should be terribly afraid of. Black can play b5 and hold the pawn. So then the other two variations are going to be queen c2. So we have queen c2, and we have b5, and now I would say the main line is certainly a4. I would say the move that gets played the most by amateurs here, though, is probably the move knight e5. And even though knight to d5 is possible, I would actually recommend the move pawn to c6, because there's a little bit of poison here. There's a little bit of a trap. If they take on c6 and make this exchange, you get to play rook b8, and already I feel all kinds of comfortable here. But more importantly, I'm going to play bishop b7 soon. So like after a4, a6, takes, and then I would say the most common move I run into is people try to defend this pawn on d4, either with rook d1 or pawn e3, and then I will throw in bishop to b7. And I think this is really cute, because if they take, I take back, I keep my extra pawn with a good position. And if they take on b5, which I would say has happened a few times, I've managed to pull this off, then queen d5 is completely winning. I'm threatening mate, and I'm threatening the bishop. So I would recommend pawn to c6 just for this trap, basically. I like this trap, and I think objectively, I think c6 and knight d5 are pretty equivalent moves, but I like to give my opponent some more opportunities to go wrong. So a4, b5, and then there's kind of two moves that I think can be played here, and I'm not sure which one is best. I would say right now the main line is queen c4, and then there's kind of two alternatives that are pretty similar. There's knight fd2, and there's knight fd2, and then the other alternative is knight on b to d2, trying to recapture with the knight on d2. Out of these two, I would say the knight on b to d2 alternative is kind of the most dangerous. Knight on b to d2 with the idea of capturing on the c4 square is kind of the most dangerous, but this also pitters out to equality pretty fast. The main line is basically just black finishes his development, bishop b7, knight c4, and then we just break in the middle with c5. and these positions are considered both equal and boring. dc5, bishop e4, queen d1, and then simply knight on b to d7 to harvest this pawn. A draw was actually agreed right here between Rajabov and Nakamura. They didn't want to go into the rest of this boringness. But for the rest of us that don't know the theory, just developing your knight, exchanging everything, pretty much pitters out to just dead equality. We're just trading off everything. And then this position here is pretty equal. Although you can play this out. This was played out in Rager versus Vallejo Pawns in 2011, which just ended in a draw. So there was nothing, no huge amount of awesomeness to write home about. So we have queen c2, b5, and then we have a4, b4, and then of course the other possibility, other than knight on b to d2 and knight on f to d2, is queen c4. So knight f d2 is the other possibility, and then here again I recommend, this is one of those cases again where you can play c6. And then here you can actually get away with just grabbing this pawn. And this position is supposed to be acceptable for black, although it did end again in some more draws. It ended in a draw between Ronian and Nakamura in St. Louis in 2014. But as you can see, black has finished its development and shouldn't have any serious problems. So queen c4 is the main line. I recommend bishop a6, just taking this diagonal immediately. Queen c2, knight on b to d7, knight e5. Now here it's really interesting. The main line is to take this knight and allow the capture of the bishop on a8. They can certainly take. They can play bishop takes a8. And then the main line right now is actually queen takes d4 is considered the main line. And I forget what the actual overall assessment of this position is. I know this is supposed to be okay for black. I actually recommend doing like a much more pure exchange sacrifice. I actually recommend just taking on a8 and going after these light squares. And again, I think if the assessment is similar, I just prefer to have light squares than not having light squares. And then after d takes e5, I recommend knight g4. Now what's really interesting is they still have to give me this pawn. I don't think they have a really great way to hold this pawn. Now if they try to hold this pawn with, say, a move like f4, you have this kind of amazing attack against the light squares that just is incredible. You can play the move bishop takes e2. The issue is they can't take it. Like, they can't play queen takes e2 because you have bishop c5 check, and you're dominating both light and dark squares here with a decisive attack against the white king. So there is actually no real way to defend after bishop e2. So like after bishop e2, rook e1, again, we have to stay on this diagonal. We can't really do anything about this. We can play queen f3, and they can't actually, this is kind of embarrassing, they can't actually take on e2. So like if queen e2, they have the same problem of bishop c5, and then say bishop e3, knight e3, they have to sacrifice their queen because otherwise they're getting mated. So the other question is, can they play rook e2? They can. We still don't have the immediate bishop c5 because queen takes c5. Here we have the calm, collected rook d8, which amazingly wins. White doesn't have a move here, which is just incredible. White has no developing moves because, like, any developing move will either get captured or will lose the rook. White's queen can't move because we have bishop c5 coming. And I've always wanted to pull this off in a game because this would just be the coolest move to play, this next move. After rook e1, which is basically forced, black wins with this amazing move that I want to play so bad, rook d2. And the idea is this is the ultimate disruption move. We're threatening mate in 2 and mate in 1. We're threatening queen g2 mate. So we have to do something. But literally anything that we capture this rook with will lead to mate in some way. So if we capture with the bishop or the knight, we're getting checkmated with queen f2, queen h2. And if we capture with the queen, we're running into bishop c5. So they would have to play queen d2, bishop c5, and then they would have to lose their queen. So this is a little bit of preparation that I would like to pull off at some point, but basically it kind of revolves around capturing. The main thing is it revolves around capturing on A8 instead of capturing on D4, and then going after these light squares after takes, just playing the move knight to G4, and then they kind of have to give us back this pawn. They don't really have an alternative. So like say after knight D2, I would actually continue targeting the light squares. I would play a move like say queen D5, then we can take this pawn. And I would say this position is unclear. We have a lot of compensation for the material. White hasn't found a clear way to unwind his position or fix anything. And of course, in the other variation, we similarly get this pawn, and we still end up down an exchange, and we're supposed to have compensation in that position as well. So I don't see a huge difference between the two positions, except that I think if you take on A8, I think white has weaker light squares, and I think that you have this possibility of playing this cool game with rook D8 and rook D2, which would just be absolutely amazing. So anyway, so that's in the queen C2 line. So of course the absolute main line is not queen C2. The absolute main line is the move knight E5. And here you do have to know about this move. You notice your queen side here. It's very awkward to finish development on the queen side without everything kind of falling apart. So you do have to know how to hit back in the center with knight C6. And we don't care that we're sacrificing pawns here, because all the pawns that we're sacrificing are doubled and tripled and they're ugly, so he can have all of them. They're basically, the one thing that we've got going for us with these pawns is that they're in the middle of the board, and that's going to make them strong, and they are extra. So after, say, for example, and it can be either or, but I would say the majority of people do actually take with the bishop, and then we take with the queen, and then we just basically have to remember to hit in the center with the move E5. So like say after they play queen C2 or queen A4. I'm not sure how much difference it makes. We're going to play, against queen C2, we can play C5. And against queen A4, I would say the main line is E5. After takes, queen takes, we're going to play bishop E6. And black is actually down a pawn here, but black's position is supposed to be acceptable for that pawn. So like say after rook A D8, queen E3, we simply play queen H5. And then pawn F3 to cover the light squares. And now apparently the best move here is bishop c4, although I think in several games I've played the move rook e8 and gotten reasonable results. But the move bishop c4 is supposed to be best, and this was actually played in Maklov versus Grishchuk in Moscow in 2007. And actually Grishchuk came out on top after bishop c4. The game continued knight c3, rook fe8. Notice black has a lot of activity for his material. And that game continued with g4, queen g6, queen f2, knight d5, takes, h5, f6, rook e5, and white still hasn't finished his development. White's position is still kind of awkward. e4, f5, and this ended up going very well for black. Black is actually still down the pawn here, and it doesn't matter because black still has all of this activity against this very, very loose white king. And he was able to make that matter on the light squares by simply lining up his pieces. So at this point, it's either going to be a black win or white's going to find some miracle perpetual, which he failed to find. So this was a win for black and the guy that was the best at playing the white side of the Catalan, Vladimir Kramnik, versus Hikura Nakamura in Paris in 2016. So when we look at this stuff, when we look at these openings, we have to basically, I think, when we play the Catalan, we have to put some pressure on white. We have to play the open Catalan. And then, of course, we have to know our theory very carefully to finish our development and or to keep that pawn. And I think this puts the most pressure that we can put on white to at least make him have a little bit of knowledge to try to navigate these structures. Of course, there's a lot more theory here other than what I just covered in this video. This is just a brief overview of the ideas and how to face, in my mind, how to meet the Catalan as black. Well, I hope you found this video helpful, and I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you for watching.